I am reading the welcome introduction from Alistair Iles. So welcome to a special Environmental Science Policy and Management Department seminar. Today I'm delighted to present Professor Javiera Barandiaran to talk about living minerals, a paradigm for advancing climate equity and justice. She's our ESPOM departmental candidate for the campus search for a new professor on climate equity and environmental justice. Javiera works as an associate professor in the Global Studies Department at UC Santa Barbara. She received her PhD from ESPOM, as well as a master's in public policy from the Goldman School here at Berkeley. So today is something of a homecoming for Javiera. She's worked across a wide range of environmental issues in Chile and across Latin America, as well as in California. More recently, she's been looking at the politics of critical minerals in energy transition, dissecting the push for a more radical, environmentally rooted constitution in Chile, and calling for scientists to be more actively engaged in climate struggles. Javiera has a new book coming out with MIT Press next month called Living Minerals, Nature, Trade, and Power in the Race for Lithium. And her talk today will cover some of her book themes. Javiera is also the co-director of the UC-wide Center for Climate Justice, as well as the director of the Center for Restorative Environmental Work at UC Santa Barbara. So please welcome Javiera.
Put a timer on just to try to keep track of time. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's really such a pleasure to be back. As Seth said, a bit of a homecoming for me. I want to give my really deepest thanks to Isha and Rachel for chairing this campus-wide search and for inviting me, and Seth for being the departmental chair who's been very gracious in helping me come here. And of course, Kelly, I assume somewhere around here, Kelly, who has been organizing behind all of the logistics. So thank you, everyone, for the really kind invitation to be here. I also, before I get started, just want to give a quick word of thanks to everyone who has contributed to the research that I'm going to be sharing today. The funding came primarily from the National Science Foundation, and we live in times where it feels very important to acknowledge that they were funding work abroad, which I think is increasingly threatened, and also work related to justice and equity issues. I also was lucky to have a writing residency sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation and the American Academy of Berlin. Without that time to really focus on writing, it would have been very difficult to get this book done. And of course, all my collaborators in academia, in law, and activism who work in Chile, in Argentina, and in so many countries around the world. So I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of how I got interested in the topic of lithium. It was 2012, and I was finishing my field work research for my PhD in Chile when I learned that Chile is actually a major producer of lithium. I had, although Chile is a mining country, I had never known that amongst all the minerals that Chile produces, lithium was one of them. When I was back in the United States, news like this was beginning to pop up at the time. And the byline of this New Yorker article caught my attention. Can Bolivia become the Saudi Arabia of the electric car era? Now, for me, with deep roots in Chile and in Argentina, my family is originally from Argentina. So neighboring countries that have also very large lithium deposits, as does Bolivia. The idea of becoming like Saudi Arabia was completely alarming because it signaled more foreign intervention, more war, ecological destruction, and grossly unequal development. So these were things very far from the hopes and dreams of the environmental movements and the communities that I had been working with while doing my PhD work. And so suddenly the prospect of the electric car era seemed like more of the same at the global level and more violence at the local level. Fast forward 12 years later, on the heels of a really frustrating COP climate conference that just finished in Brazil, as you all know, I think the possibility of defining even more territories, primarily by their place in the global mineral production chain, is even closer than it was before. So my goal is to inspire you and really everyone that might read the book that I've just finished, inspire you to think differently, to think of lithium not as a strategic commodity, but as an element of nature. Hopefully to think of not just lithium, but any mineral, and certainly not of any territory as strategic, but to think of them as elements of nature to be used with humility and care in order to advance climate equity and environmental justice. So to meaningfully address climate equity and climate change, I argue that we need to shift from an old thinking of strategic minerals that has been with us from the 1950s, if not longer, to a paradigm of living minerals, which emerges in partnership with a diverse set of voices. So scientific voices, indigenous, feminist, many others, ecological practitioners and thinkers, who have been working in these ways for a long time. And so living minerals can deliver better and more equitable climate action, but it does require that we reckon with some difficult subjects like environmental political memories and sort of the conjunction of those two things, and structural inequalities. Now, one reason that living minerals, I think, is a much better pathway to climate equity than strategic minerals is that strategic minerals puts its faith in technological fixes, primarily electric vehicles, which, as you can see in this graph, they're just getting bigger and bigger and therefore more and more unsustainable, not just here in the United States, you can see the big red line, but really everywhere around the world, all for the profit of car companies, car manufacturers. And so there's been intense hype around lithium for a few reasons. So markets love it because it's really difficult to count and map, and that makes it very easy to speculate with. And it also leaves intact consumption as if this were a real solution to climate change problems. I do think, the reason that lithium is important to EVs is that it's the most lightweight metal, and therefore it's really important for portable batteries of any kind. And we're very likely to continue to need lithium in that sense. And I do want to be clear that EVs are still better than gas cars. That's, I don't think that's very debatable, but it leaves intact the inequities and the injustices of these markets. So what we see is that EVs are delivering sort of inequality in access, these increasingly unaffordable cars. And right now the news is all a buzz about the term affordability, but these are really unaffordable cars in many ways. The mineral and fossil fuel needs, and these two things are quite linked. We really haven't seen that kind of decoupling yet, but in mineral and fossil fuel needs that are a direct threat to people's lands and waters, and all of it done within a context of resource nationalism that pits the welfare of one country, of one community against the welfare of another. And so it creates this very zero-sum dynamic. By resource nationalism, I mean that government efforts to control the production and trade of a natural resource to advance a national goal like military power and national development goals, which may or may not be equitable, but have a difficult, complicated history. So resource nationalism, we can think of it as both a cause and a symptom of climate inequities and of global inequities. And it's really this that we see in that New Yorker byline, right? It's resource nationalism thinking that leads that kind of question: can Bolivia become the Saudi Arabia of the electric car era? And really imposing that question, the journalist is saying a lot more about US anxieties than he is about Bolivian desires. Finally, all of this really helps to preserve the carbon economy, because it creates this illusion that lithium replaces coal as EVs replace gas cars, when in reality, gas cars find new lives elsewhere. The oil industry is investing in lithium, and all of us are spending a lot more time thinking about how to secure lithium supplies than we are thinking about how to phase out and close down oil production. And we see this at some, COP after COP, We've seen this here in California, recent policies, even the governor expanding oil licenses in Central Valley that we were mentioning earlier. So that's basically the argument that I'm going to be making today in sections 2, 3, and 4 of the talk. First, I wanted to say a little bit more about myself and my research, and then my closing comments, I'll also talk about my next research projects. Yeah, so as you know, I got my PhD here in ESPM, and with training in Science and Technology Studies, or STS, after having completed a master's just up the hill in the Goldman School. And ever since then, I've been at UCSB in the Global Studies Department. I've just finished, or in the process of finishing, my very first quarter as chair of the department. So that's been fun, let's just say. My scholarship examines environmental politics and policy to understand the relationship between nature expertise and democratic governance, and the consequences of all this for justice and equity. So some of my past projects have examined questions around trust in science, and questions of whose voices are excluded or marginalized when we think of policy processes like environmental impact assessments, but also where science has been privatized, is the case increasingly in Chile, and where people have sort of compete in this marketplace of data and of scientific ideas. And I look at the consequences of this for accountability, for public trust, fairness, and environmental outcomes, and how those are distributed. I've also looked at how local knowledges are marginalized or misrepresented when they participate in global processes and public policies, and including in courts of law. Building on a 2018 Mellon Sawyer seminar on energy justice, I co-founded in 2022 the Cruz Center for Restorative Environmental Work. And this is a photo from a recent event we held with members of the Chumash Band of Santa Barbara, and other indigenous allies from Hawaii and Northern California, where we were discussing land rematriation practices. And so over the few years, Crew has become a hub on campus for this kind of work, and also for graduate mentorship and climate justice reading groups. Most of my work has focused on Chile. I also served for 2 years as the UC faculty director for study abroad programs there and in Argentina. And that was arguably the funnest thing I have ever done. So I definitely always recommend study abroad. But through both the Mellon and the Crew, I've also developed and maintained some California focused research. So as Seth mentioned, I'm really excited to share material today for my forthcoming book. Publication day is about a month away from today. Finally, it's called Living Minerals, Nature, Trade, and Power in the Race for Lithium. And what makes the book really novel from a methodological perspective is that I look at mining holistically, meaning I cut across both minerals and time. There's a lot of scholarship that will look at one mineral at a time. You know, there's books about tin and copper and all, specific mineral. And then other books will look at one country at a time. Instead, I focused on the trade in minerals between Chile and the United States. And I chose these two countries very strategically because these are friendly allied nations that have been trading minerals with each other for 150 years. Specifically, they have been buying and selling nitrate, copper, and now lithium. And each three of these has been at different times an emblematic global commodity, where Chile has been the primary, a leading global producer at different times. So in many ways, we can think of this as a mineral trade that's in conditions of as good as it gets. Friendly nations, emblematic commodities. So I analyzed documents, reports, promotional materials, etc., correspondence produced by scientists and professionals working for industry and government in Chile and Argentina. And reflecting my training in STS, I looked at for scientific controversies, and I scrutinized the methods used to map and count the desert landscapes where mining was happening, to understand the ways in which expertise shaped the mineral trade. And so in a nutshell, the argument of the book is that we need to reckon with and understand past misrepresentations of nature in order to understand this unsustainable mineral trade and why we are sort of headed towards repeating those same patterns. And to advance equity, we need to center and think about how nature is, we need to center nature in how we explain things like trade and globalization. So we need to bring this into our explanations of the global economy. So first, I'll say a little bit more about lithium. First, as you can see, there's been a massive increase in the mining of lithium since 2016. The key thing here is that there's a massive mining boom happening, and it is only now getting started. By one estimate, the International Energy Agency is calling for a doubling of the tonnage of minerals extracted from underground in the next 5 years, so to the end of this decade. So it's a huge, huge amount we're talking about. The lithium supply chain is complicated from a chemical point of view because the chemistry of lithium is really difficult and delicate and interesting. But from a geographic point of view, it's quite simple. Lithium is currently mined in just a few countries in North and South America and in Australia, and then nearly all of it goes to China for processing, which is what the USGS, I guess, was trying to capture in this slightly bizarre infographic where they've just taken China and plonked it in the middle of the global map. So to zoom in on the deposit, this is the region of South America that concentrates the greatest number of lithium deposits. And here's a close-up of the high altitude deserts of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, where the lithium happens. The white spots are the salt flats from where we extract the lithium. I've been focusing on two places. The first one here, the Salar de Atacama, or Atacama Salt Flat, gets its name from the bigger Atacama Desert where it's located. And it's the oldest and largest mine operating in this region. And here, the Silver Peak mine in Nevada, just not far from here. And so brine mining was pioneered in California at Searles Lake in the 1930s. In the 1960s, it moved to Silver Peak, Nevada. And then in the 1970s, it moved to Chile's Atacama. And so there are direct links between the US and the Chilean lithium mines that are mirrored in direct links between US and Chilean copper mines and US and Chilean fertilizer mines. And in the book, I sort of discuss these different links across these different minerals. But today I'll focus on lithium. And so the very same people working for the very same company, the mineral company that built the Silver Peak mine, then went to Chile to build the Atacama mine. And so that's also part of the reason why it makes a lot of sense to look at them together. And we published this book called Lithium Landscapes that pairs images of these two sites. That gives you an idea of just how similar they appear when you're looking at them. So very quickly, brine lithium mining is very different from hard rock mining, which is the other major deposit of lithium. And as you can see from this photo, this is the largest hard rock mine in Australia. This is very similar to a gold or a copper mine. So diesel trucks, explosives, tailings, large piles of chemicals and toxic waste, etc. Brine mining is something else. This is the brine lithium mine in the Atacama Salt Flat, just seen from a commercial flight. And the important thing here is, you see the phase chemistry is what accounts for the different colors of the pools that you can see. And so this is basically the brine that's sitting there. And each one of these brines and each one of these salt flats is absolutely unique. So the brines are water, salts, and elements, including potassium, magnesium, calcium, boron, all kinds of things. And it really is as if both the salt flat and the brine itself were rebelling against our efforts to commodify them, because each one is unique, and so the process has to be figured out again each time at each site, and makes it complicated. This gives you a bit more detail about the process, and again, the underground architecture or morphology of the salt flats is unique each time. Lithium is, like all minerals, not a renewable resource, it will run out. It is also not particularly scarce. What is scarce is cheap lithium, and the Atacama lithium is the cheapest lithium out there. So there's many impacts that lithium has. It is destructive on the landscape. It creates piles of waste, but the number one concern for the communities who live in these areas is water loss. And these two images from Silver Peak and the Atacama help to drive home that this is a massive water operation in both sites. And so the harms and burdens of lithium mining, as is typical, are unevenly distributed. And this is causing, of course, many climate injustices and inequities that are felt acutely by Indigenous communities. From a climate equity perspective, worldwide, Indigenous communities are the ones that are feeling most acutely the impacts of this mining rush. Of course, they're the ones who have been most punished by colonialism and modernization and have contributed the very least to climate change. And Nevada helps to illustrate this. So here you see in the map sort of pre-contact or ancestral Shoshone lands. And then in 1863, federal treaty effectively led to them being forced off their lands. A year later, the town of Silver Peak was founded by settler families. And in my research, I didn't find much evidence of Shoshone living in Silver Peak. But today, Shoshone peoples, together with Paiute and Bannock peoples, further north are protesting, resisting other lithium mining that's happening. And they put up this sign, "Life over lithium," in the Fort McDermott Thacker Pass area. The situation in Chile is both similar and different, and I'm happy to answer more questions about this in the Q&A. There are 18 Licanantay Atacameño communities that live here. This recent book by my friend and colleague, Sally Babbage, provides a really deep ethnographic account of how one community, Peine, which is closest to the mines, is coping with this onslaught of industrial projects. These are images of members of the Coyo Ayu, which is a little north of Peine. And this is a project by a colleague at UC San Diego, also doing sort of digital interviews that are accessible to everyone on how communities are impacted. Now, across the board, there's a lot of conflict around the lithium mining in these communities, but there's a shared sense of worry and frustration about the impacts that mining is having on the desert. So as the ecosystem becomes increasingly exhausted, possibly to the point of extinction, water, as water disappears, all life is suffering. This includes life like emblematic species like the flamingo on my book's cover. It includes also single-celled microbes that live in the salt flat brines. And these microbes were among the very first life forms to be producing ozone and oxygen, and they made all subsequent life, including our own, possible on this planet. So from that perspective, we might even call these microbes our oldest living ancestors. And this is an image from a Guardian documentary that was published just last week. It's a really beautifully done documentary. And here you have a sort of one of these microbes juxtaposed with flamingos on a salt flat to highlight the richness of the microbial life in these places. So the Licanantay who live here, they keep farms and animals, and they know how to live with water scarcity. They're also complaining bitterly about the compounded effect of mining at the pace and scale that we see. So to understand how we got here and why the lithium trade promises to reproduce old patterns of inequity and injustice, I turned to examine the history of mineral trading between the US and Chile. So since the 19th century, for over 150 years, the Atacama Desert has been central to global mineral markets. This is not a new phenomenon for this region. It has provided most of the world's copper and most of the world's natural nitrates, which are used as fertilizers and as explosives, and now most of the world's lithium as well. And this painting celebrates life in one of these nitrate towns in its heyday in the 1940s. This is the same town today. Its refineries and processing plants are in ruins, homes and the town center are vacant, and across the Atacama Desert, you will find the ruins of past industrial activity. And this includes both infrastructure that was valuable, as well as waste piles of rock and toxic mine tailings. Ruins and waste are common also in Silver Peak. And if you visit today, you will find intense poverty, a vacant village center, abandoned homes, abandoned and rusting trucks and cars. It's sort of where cars seem to go to die, really. And like in the Atacama, you can see in the distance the cake-like piles of mining waste. Now this image provides, the season greetings card provides a glimpse of a better time in Silver Peak a few decades ago. So since its founding, Silver Peak has been a small village of family-run mom and pop mining companies like this one, the Leprechaun Mining and Chemical Company. And this card captures a time when capitalism operated with a more human face, a face that was, quite white, Christian, and middle class. And what's funny about this is that Leprechaun was the really unlikely group that actually discovered the lithium in the Nevada brines. So at a time when the USGS and the Foot Mineral Company, so this large multinational company, were looking everywhere for the next big lithium deposit, it was this group of, called themselves the wee folk, who actually discovered the lithium mines and licensed it. And now my point here is not to glorify the past, but to acknowledge what was achieved and what was lost. Because it is these memories that in the book I call mining memories that are animating today's resource nationalism in both countries. And so both Silver Peak and the nitrate towns of the Atacama, they enjoyed relative prosperity, a sense of a tight-knit community, and a sense of pride in hard, honest work. And they lost these achievements even as new mines were built. The mining didn't close and disappear. New mines came and continue to come to these places. They lost these things for many reasons, but I argue that it has a lot to do with environmental mismanagement rooted in misrepresentations of nature. And this is an important point because we tend to explain loss of this kind by turning to explanations like globalization or poor governance, that this was bad policy, that these were incompetent or corrupt governments, that this was, global trade taking things elsewhere. The important thing here is that it was rooted in an environmental mismanagement that therefore put climate inequities and into the very fabric of the mineral trade. Now, you may have noticed perhaps that these were very generically speaking mining memories. So how does the lithium come back in? And this is where lithium adds a special twist to the story because it has a really interesting history of speculative future uses, which helps to underscore the ways in which memories are always about what we thought the future would be like, about aspirations for the future. So before World War II, lithium was used very sparingly. It's with World War II that it comes into widespread use. And specifically right after the war, because of its uses in the hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb. So this Popular Science article calling lithium the H-bomb metal and promising that to usher in a mining boom to equal any gold rush in history. So like all nuclear materials, lithium's nuclearity really changed its politics and its economics. At the time, the US Atomic Energy Agency had a huge stockpile, and stockpiles are now making a big comeback. They're again all over the news. It was the sole buyer, and it bought it from just two producers, Foot Mineral and the Lithium Corporation of America, or LITHCO. So with one buyer and two producers, there was really zero chance of lithium running out. There was no reason why there should be this kind of gold rush thinking. But still, the US government then was using every trick in the playbook to try to control global trade. Outside of the military, the lithium had a lot of potential, and I emphasize that. It was all potential. And this cover from Lithgow's annual report, 1955, sort of helps to drive that home. It's very similar to the uses today, pretty much all the same. So we have atomic energy in the form of nuclear fusion power, batteries, pharmaceuticals, etc. And so Lithgow and Foote, through these years, were building huge research and development laboratories to develop new uses for lithium, to find new buyers. But they needed not only a good product, but also the promise of reliable and cheap future supplies, right? And so you take these two things together, US trade controls and this very speculative search for deposits, and the priority was always more mining, no matter what the equity or justice consequences might be, for very speculative uses, even though there was no actual market or need for this material. But the solution was always more mining. In the 1960s, electric cars with lithium-ion batteries, they became the next big thing. And so this is an image from 1967 from the Foote Minerals magazine. And I love it because it's so similar to today. Flying taxis, in Orange County, they are now piloting flying taxis. Electrified roads, which is something that periodically comes in and out of the news, and different kinds of car sharing ideas where the boundaries between private cars and public transit become really blurred. You see, a few years later, the Los Angeles Times in 1970 wrote, "Electric autos could revive Ghost Town," in reference to Silver Peak, which, as you now know, was not revived on the terms that this journalist imagined. So we see this real recurrence of the same kinds of languages that we see today. So Foote wrote in this article, quote, "Faced with the urgent need to maintain an environment in which he can survive, man is virtually destined to eventually develop some kind of an electric car into a highly efficient, low-cost means of personal transportation. A lithium battery of some kind seems virtually assured." So to close this section of my talk, mining memories are a useful analytical tool for examining the aspirations different groups have pinned on minerals. These memories are affective and empirical, backward and forward-looking, and lithium mining sheds a particularly bright light on the power of fears of mineral shortages and hopes for clean and infinite energy. Now, the industrial scientists who built the lithium brine mines of Silver Peak and Atacama, they were central to sustaining these hopes and fears through misrepresentations of nature that they authored. They articulated fictions about nature that enabled organizing extraction in these unsustainable and eventually very unjust and inequitable ways. So these fictions included manufactured uncertainties over how to count lithium deposits, selective ignorance about the effects of pumping on the brines and on the salt flats, and of the behavior of the brines if they leaked or were re-injected, and very narrow ideas about the water cycle. So in all these years, decades of correspondence between Leprechaun, Foote, USGS, and their Chilean partners, there's very rare mentions, if any, of the water in this landscape and the life forms that depended on this water cycle in the world's driest desert. And honestly, I found this surprising because as this photo from 1975 really helps to drive home, this was a massive water operation. The geologist pictured here, who really did a lot of this work, he described it at the time as a, quote, lake of lithium waiting to be tapped. And he then went on, after years of really this careful work of measuring this landscape and studying these brines, he went on in the space of just a few hours to split this liquid mine in two. So in order for capital to work the way it did, he was told he must demarcate one investment from another, as if the wells weren't all drawing from the exact same source, right? So even though in nature this is one connected aquifer, in law, in politics, and in markets, it had to be demarcated in two. And so this is one example of many where separation was necessary for lithium production to succeed. So for the salt flats to become industrial work sites, lithium had to be separated from potassium, value had to be separated from waste, and liquid mines had to be split in two. And these separations had to succeed in nature, in law, and in markets. Of course, this was no easy task, and it mirrors the fragmentation of nature into its component parts in ways that are very emblematic of mechanistic science. So I'm sure many of you know, mechanistic science seeks to explain the whole by identifying its component parts and how they relate to each other. And I build on Carolyn Merchant's seminal critique of mechanistic science, where she argued mechanistic science renders nature both dead and, quote, as a female to be controlled and dissected through experiment so as to legitimate the exploitation of natural resources. I'm pretty sure that, you know, Carolyn Merchant as professor probably addressed her students and colleagues in this room many times over many years. And it's really, you know, very special for me to be sharing with you that I got the title of Living Minerals from The Death of Nature in this edition. She talks in the preface about camping in the Utah desert and realizing that, quote, science viewed the desert rocks as dead and inert. Yet for much of human history, those very rocks had been alive, growing and reproducing like plants and animals. So how then to see nature differently, not as dead, inert, appropriable, and made of components that relate like cogs in a machine? The salt flats helped me see things differently, and you know, to go back to those, our oldest living ancestors, the microbial single cell forms in the salt flat. So the Likanantai people, they have a special name for these microbes. They call them living rocks. Because although they might look and feel like rocks, and this is what you see here, they are actually living and reproducing. And if you look carefully enough, you will see them grow over very, very long periods of time. And so as a paradigm, Living Minerals asks us to pay attention to both scientific representations of nature and also mining memories, because as important as scientific representations have been, they remain rooted in cultural, political, and economic commitments, which have positioned scientists as allies or even the vanguard of capital and colonialism over history. And this is illustrated particularly well by the history of mineral trading between the US and Chile. How we represent nature matters a great deal, not just for understanding the past, but also for new legal systems that recognize that humans are part of the Earth's living systems and that challenge traditional legal models that treat nature as properties. And so this includes rights of nature as part of this broader ecological jurisprudence. So you can see this huge increase in ecological jurisprudence. This is itself an achievement of many EJ movements around the world. And it is also a reflection of the fact that we really face an existential threat because of human activities, and mining is a lead activity in this realm. Ecological jurisprudence raises also a real challenge of who speaks for nature, for example, in courts of law. And a lot of scholars in the rights of nature world are increasingly turning to scientists as the privileged spokespeople of nature. In the book, I argue that this would really be a grave mistake to leave this to the scientists alone. And I hope that this history helps to show why that would be, and the importance of leading towards a much more plural, both science and plural set of voices that are part of those conversations. So to tie this back to developments in Chile, in 2022, elected officials in Chile drafted a new proposed constitution, which environmental organizations called an eco-constitution. And it contained many really progressive and forward-thinking ideas about what ecological jurisprudence might be. For example, it recognized minerals as finite and non-renewable and future generations' rights to minerals. It introduced concepts of repair and natural common goods. And it sought to redefine also science, replacing a singular science with a more plural systems of knowledges, both in the plural and recognizing sort of the damages and the harms caused by epistemic injustices and sort of legacies of colonialism. The Constitution was rejected, and sort of a lot of the environmental issues, as often happens, sort of drowned out by other salient electoral issues. But it continues to be, I think, a really important experience and legal document that advanced ecological jurisprudence with a particularly clear-eyed commitment to social justice. And for that reason alone, I think it deserves a lot more scrutiny. And I think I see it as one more step in trying to implement a living minerals paradigm. So to close, I've described living minerals as a new paradigm that draws on plural voices, so indigenous science, feminist approaches, and moving away from mechanistic notions of science that's rooted in ecological jurisprudence, and that really opens up how we talk about and represent nature to take into account people's lived experiences, and also how our historical and environmental memories, which as climate change accelerates, become increasingly fragmented and sort of fragile and at risk of being lost and forgotten in ways that cause further harm, further social harm to communities. That's in contrast to strategic minerals, which relies on mechanistic science, which has often been a source of misrepresentations, and this resource nationalism, where it focused a lot more on the US brand of resource nationalism than the Chilean brand, but I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So lithium mining brings into sharp relief climate inequity at the local and global level. At the local level, fence-lined communities are being forced to live with mining at a pace and scale that is really unprecedented and happening on top of already severely degraded and exhausted ecosystems. At the global level, countries like Chile are really putting forward their entire territories towards this global extractive regime. Again, at an unprecedented scale because of the sheer volume of capital available for investment, the efficiency of the machines available at its disposal, and also the voraciousness of consumer appetite. And I think this image helps to capture both of those scales of inequity. So here we are driving south on Chile's Highway 5 through the desert, and a police convoy asked us to pull over to make room for these mining trucks. So these are trucks that are used in today's open pit copper mines, and they are so big, it takes 4 loads like this one. This is just the chassis. 4 loads like this one to make one mining truck. So it really begs the question, are we going to build bigger roads, bigger ports, and bigger oil infrastructure to keep this kind of economy going? Because for mining in Chile to increase any further, this is what we need. And at lunch, we were talking about energy needs and whether they were predictable. In this region, for example, coal-fired power plants are increasingly being replaced with solar power plants, which is great, especially for the people living really close to those coal-fired power plants. But the scale of the solar is such that it is also dispossessing people of those lands and waters, but also it also requires sort of expanding the infrastructure in every which way. And so, and the energy consumption has doubled just over the last decade for the mining to make room for this increased pace of mining. So it becomes a really spiraling, exponentially growing situation. So I've also analyzed quickly also to just summarize why EVs are a false solution to climate change, and what happens when we marginalize voices that do not conform to mechanistic science. So I'm just going to go to talk more about my next project. So looking forward, I'm going to be continuing to write more about lithium, now looking at new lithium extraction technologies and places where lithium mining isn't yet happening. I'm also writing more about the constitutional process and analyzing some of the ideas and the movements that went into that. But my next big project is focused on what I'm calling increasingly urbanized glaciers. So for a few years, I've been working with Chilean colleagues on several things related to glaciers, but we've put together this social inventory of glaciers that tries to capture the deep connection between people and these places that sort of seem kind of very far away, very inaccessible to most. And there you can read about this conflict in particular, which was involved a gold mining company that proposed to move some glaciers in order to protect them. And this idea was just so preposterous, it led to a massive outcry, and it actually led to quite a lot of policy change. But at the heart of it, and I've written about it and elsewhere, including in my dissertation that Nancy might remember, at the heart of the company's plan was the idea of the glaciers as just inert ice, that this is just inert, dead nature there for the taking and the moving wherever we want to put it. We now have a much better appreciation of the ways in which glaciers are also living systems. They can't just be picked up and moved. So in the capital city, Santiago, place of 8 million people, we have increasing, growing conflict between glaciers and mining as the mining is expanding and encroaching increasingly into glaciers. And we perhaps have also increasing problems with living glaciers as they are living more wildly and melting in more unpredictable ways and sort of causing all kinds of changes at the very top of our not just our watershed, but our living scape, right? The city is sort of directly below. So just above that snow, beyond that snow line, there's about 300 glaciers up there. Hopefully many of these will very soon be protected in a brand new national park, Glaciers of Santiago National Park. And so I'm interested in this park, and as I think ESPAM faculty know very well from decades of research that has happened here, parks are particularly excellent, privileged places that bring to light race and class differences, historical legacies of dispossession, and that really sort of pit, different views of nature against each other and sort of provide a very good place from where to study these. And so at stake in this project are questions like who has a right to nature and a right to the city when the two are now understood to be sort of really inextricably linked to each other. I've been working with an NGO that's been behind the campaign to create this park, and one of the concerns that they have is how do we make this park in the high mountains accessible to working class Chileans when we really don't know anything about them and where they go on holiday, what do they do for recreation? And so that's one of the interesting questions that we've been grappling with there. And so the same environmental equity and justice concerns that motivated the lithium project are present also here. So now it's mining for copper, for the renewable, for electrification that is putting intense pressure, not just on out-of-the-way communities, but major urban centers. We have also the solution of parks that raises all kinds of questions around equity in access, including equity in access to leisure, and leisure being an important idea to think about when we think about degrowth or post-growth thinking. And instead of the global trade, this project is focused on climate adaptation policies at the urban level. And the glaciers already have raised question around whose knowledge of nature counts when we're dealing with these big issues. Thank you.